Now I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite recs, some good friends of mine. These are Angus breeders. They're top of the waza. They do the very best job, or considered one of the very best Angus seed stock producers in Australia. Their website at the time said, look, this is how we manage BVD. What we do is we just test all our bulls, and we vaccinate all our bulls for Pesty, Vibrio, and Lepto before we sell them. And we know we have it, but we believe because we rotationally graze that we get plenty of exposure. And so this is a rec. So you can see the rec here. When is a rec in BVD? It's when groups of animals without immunity meet a PI in opportune time. So this guy here was probably coming around this corner, probably on the iPhone or whatever, and realized that this bridge is pretty narrow. Hit the brakes. You can see the skid marks there, right in his jocks, right there in his jocks. That's skid marks. Sorry. Favorite joke. So let me tell you about this particular rec at the seed stock producer. So in their 2003 drop Y heifers, there was a PI. So they were weaned, commingled. They weaned pretty early. They were boxed. They lived together, rotationally grazed. They looked after them nutritionally. They got them grown out. They did everything right. They didn't vaccinate their herd for Pesty. They just test their bulls and vaccinate their bulls to protect their clients. So there's a PI in there. These girls lived together for a long time prior to mating. So how many PIs do you expect to find when these girls calve? The bull comes in. He mates them. What you would expect is if that PI falls pregnant, she'll have a PI calf. But everybody else is immune. So if you see the green is naive and the blue is immune, because they've lived together for a while, the other cows are pretty immune. So this PI is a threat to the management, to the production system as far as the property, but not a threat to this management group, if that makes sense. Other than if she's a PI, she's going to meet the calves of these other calves, and her calf is going to be a PI, and it's going to live with these other calves. So we've got to keep that in the back of our head. And this particular stud, they had the next group of calves, and this group of calves were born from every management group on the farm except for the Y calves. So these girls were yearlings when these girls were born, and these girls, if you looked at their mothers were all immune to BVD. They'd all had BVD in the past or been exposed to BVD in the past. Every management group was immune. They'd already done the serology with their local veterinarian, and everything was immune. So when they were born, they got some immunity from their mothers, as you do from colostrum, but by 6 months of age, that would have gone away. And then this is these girls getting ready to get mated. If they would have looked at them then, if they'd have said, have you ever met, where's Wally? Or have you ever met Wally? They would have said, never heard of him. They were naive. And this can happen this happened in a herd that knew it was endemically infected. But that was the problem with a lot of the technical advisory group when I was working with Pfizer before we did the ACV steering committee, was that our advice was to check your status and then make decisions for your future. But the thing about BVD is you've got to constantly check your status. Every group of heifers represents a new population. So if they would have come back in here and done some blood testing, they would have said, well, look, they're all immune. And if they were talking to me, I would have said, we should ear notch. And they would have said, well, hell, we know we've got it. And look, this is the outcome we expected. We expected our cows to be immune. That's why we don't vaccinate. We know we've got PIs. And I would have said, well, it's a fair call, but I think you should ear notch. And they'd say, well, we don't agree. And I'd say, well, that's cool. It's your property. It's your chook. The next year, if I would have gotten onto that property and had shot the breeze with them, and they're in Victoria, so I'm over here, if I would have been shooting the breeze with them then, I'd have said, well, let's bleed these heifers. And they said, well, we bled them last year and they were immune. I said, well, that was last year's, guys. Let's look at these girls. If we would have blood tested them, they would have gone, holy shit, they're naive. How can that happen? And I said, well, that's kind of how BVD works. Does this mean we're BVD free? I say, well, it's evidence that you have a low, essentially a fairly low amount of BVD circulating, because none of the animals we randomly tested had exposure to a PI. Some of them in that group could have had exposure, but we didn't bleed all of them. We only bled 5%. But what we know from our blood test, by bleeding 5% of them, there are 335 in there, so we would have bled about, maybe say 20 or so, or 18. We just said we know that none of them are PIs. Some of them may have been exposed before, but we know that none of them actually are PIs, because otherwise they'd all be immune, or a high proportion. And then say, well, all right, cool. Oh, shit, what should we do? And I say, well, I think you should think about vaccinating. And they might have gone, well, hell, I don't know. I don't know about that. We don't really have much of a problem. We've never had a problem before. Everything's been pretty normal. I say, well, heck, again, it's your chook. But this is my advice. I'd be vaccinating these girls. What I definitely wouldn't advocate is taking these girls and boxing them with the other group, which is exactly what they did. So those green ones, they were AI'd twice and then backed up for, I think, 6 weeks, and then preg tested 6 weeks after. And so they were 1.5 to 4 months pregnant, and it was a very tough season in Victoria. So they were hand feeding them. And they were also hand feeding the first calvers, which was, the red girl and her and the rest of those blue girls. And because they're hand feeding both groups, they said, well, instead of running the feed cart out to 2 groups, why don't we just put these 2 groups together? It'll be a big group of about 700 animals, and we'll go out and feed them collectively. So you can see where this is going. So these girls were 1.5 to 4 months pregnant, never met a PI in their life, and they got boxed with their sisters from the previous parity. And so there's our lovely girl Rosemary, the girl in red, and there's a little calf, Rosemary's baby. And then here's all these naive girls, immune girls with their calves that are immune from natural exposure. And so what do you think is going to happen? Well, exactly what you think would happen. So the PIs would start exposing these girls at 1.5 to 4 months pregnant. They would get sick, and then they would get over it. And some of the times their calf would be born a PI, and sometimes their calf would abort. Regardless, it's a wreck. I mean, it's a serious wreck. And this is a worst case scenario. This is potentially the worst freaking case thing that can happen. And so those girls that you're bringing back from the other farm, if you're bringing them back and leaving them in their own management group, that's pretty safe. If you're boxing them with somebody else, and we'll get there in a minute, if they come back, if they go over there and there's no heifers in them and they get mated and then they calve and then they get bred again and then you preg test them and then you brought them home, and then let's say you chucked them in there with a few other animals you were bringing along that were in the same transport, and they got yarded with a PI after you preg tested them, because you're probably pregging pretty early, 6 weeks out, you could set yourself up in an identical scenario if you weren't aware of where you were at. And we'll talk more about how we mitigate these going forward. But so what ended up happening? Well, man, this was an absolute shit show. So out of the 335 girls preg tested in calf, 50 of them aborted. And that's when the vet started, who's a very good vet, started looking into it and discovered pesty was the issue. And then when they started calving, a lot of the calves would only live for about a day or two. And so they had about 50 that died before weaning. And so there were 240 left, and 120 of them were PIs. So out of 335 preg tested in calf, high value, beautiful Angus heifers, only 120 calves were born out of them. Now, when you show people that, they go, wow, that's never happened to me. Never. Holy shit. But we look back on this, like I was speaking with this hired man who's a freaking bright guy. And so we look back at that Y heifer that caused the wreck, and she was born according to the manager, he thought there'd been a wreck similarly after seeing what happened here. He said, man, this happened to us 6 or 7 years ago. But we didn't work it out. We just thought it was the season and cobalt or selenium. We just didn't know what the hell happened. We never got to the bottom of it. But they had another wreck in the heifers that just went AWOL with a lot of dead, dying calves. And one of those calves lived long enough to fall prey to get mated, and she come up empty. But she had really good breed planted figures, so they kept her. And the next year, she produced a bull calf. And the bull calf had good figures, but he never really amounted to much. So they banded him and sold him as a steer. And the next year, they produced a heifer, and that heifer was the Y cow that caused the wreck. And her calf, produced a calf. And the next year, she was empty. So she'd already been empty once as a heifer, so they culled her. And so she was gone. So we don't know if that Y cow that caused the wreck, if she came out of a PI or not. But according to the manager, the year that calf was born, she was born from a heifer, and the heifers had a similar catastrophic calving result. And that's what I think I found. Like when I first I got a really good mate down in Timboon, and when we sat down in the steering committee stuff for Pfizer, he said, look, I've never in my life as a veterinarian seen a wreck associated with reproduction relating to BVD. And I said, well, I don't really think you've been looking. You didn't know what you're looking for. And so I think once you start looking for BVD, you really start to see it. And so these guys, we went through and ear notched their entire property, and we worked out the epidemiology of where the PIs were produced. And because all of those green heifers, no matter which management group they came from, which one they were born from, the proportion of abortions, dead calves, and PIs was identical. So we broke it down. I said, can you, on these girls, because we had all the IDs, on the girls that lost their calves, can you please check for me and see what group they came from? Because we can work out if there's some groups that have a PI in them, because those girls would have been protected. We looked, and they were all the same. And so I said to him, I don't think we need to go through and ear notch everything. We've got good evidence that there's no PIs in the adult cows, that it all stemmed from these Y cows. And I said, but if you'd like, just to make sure we do things properly, we can test everything. So we tested everything, and blow me down, we found 2 more PIs on it. I rang him back, and I said, oh, mate, was wrong. We found 2 more PIs. And he said, oh, no, we didn't, Enoch. He said, we were just testing you. Those were the original 2 PIs, and we just fudged their IDs and snuck them in. So, I mean, the test is really good. So, we eradicated BVD from them, and they're on a strategy of screening their heifers prior to mating. Craig Wood's their vet, and that's what they do from now on. Yeah, you don't want one of these. You don't want these wreck. This guy's uses soil testing. And yeah, so that was a bad wreck.